to share is that if you're experiencing food insecurity, you're highly likely to be experiencing a lot of other types of challenges. You know, we think about the social determinants of health or different ways of just thinking about holistic people. Many people are experiencing food insecurity often are making trade-offs about their healthcare expenses or their employment expenses, or you know, not being able to pay their housing expenses. And this is important because if we're really empathizing with the people that we serve, the neighbors that we serve, those systems are also difficult to navigate. Sometimes in the US, unfortunately, intentionally difficult to navigate. And so that means when we create experiences that aren't easy to navigate, it's not easy to access charitable food, that's just layering on top of some of these other social needs that people have that are equally difficult to access. So the frustration and challenges can be amplified and magnified because people are trying to access these other services. In the last decade or so, food banks have been trying to do a better job of making these connections once a neighbor comes in to access charitable food to some of these other organizations, but that's still quite early in its evolution. So I thought all of this context is important to better understand who we are serving and what are some of those underlying challenges. But to really ground some of the lessons I wanted to share, I wanted to talk about a case study specifically from one organization. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay, good. From one case study and how we took that concept from initial idea through to implementation and now in the field. So the concept or the topic that I want to talk about is called Order Ahead. Order Ahead is a click and collect tool that allows people experiencing food insecurity to shop from a local food bank online and choose the pickup location that they're looking for. It's really initially was really addressing people for whom stigma was the greatest barrier. People that didn't see themselves as being able to wanting to stand in line because they didn't see themselves as someone that was in that position, or they just didn't want to be outed by their neighbors, you know, standing in line waiting for charitable food. And as we looked at different solutions, we realized that there really wasn't a lot of solutions to address that particular need. So I'm going to walk you through from the very initial concept to the end state and talk about some of the lessons that we learned over time. So the first phase of this also coincided with early days of our team as an innovation team within the national office. So we were still looking for, you know, wins and still trying to develop, you know, our portfolio of work. And so there had been a lot of great quantitative work, but there hadn't been a lot of qualitative work, which, you know, we tend to really rely upon. So building on that quantitative work about where the need was and how it was expressed, you know, we did what hopefully looks pretty familiar to everyone here as kind of phase zero work. We're really trying to understand more about how can we make charitable food more accessible to the people that we serve? What are some of those barriers to accessing charitable food, particularly looking at urban areas, and 3 very different urban areas? You know, what were some of those challenges? And so we partnered and co-designed this process with 3 food banks and 3 food pantries, and had, as you would probably typically do, a series of workshops where we co-developed kind of the learning objectives as we all went collectively out and did the research together, and then we did, you know, ideated and tried to figure out, well, what are we hearing from this, and how does it look different in these different communities? We went through the series of ethnographic interviews through to kind of prototyping. And importantly, we didn't stop at these prototypes, but we ended with lean experiments. So each community towards the end or the latter phase of this work said, okay, what does this look like in my community? And what are some of the particular challenges of food insecurity in our community? So for Northern Illinois, they really felt like they weren't reaching a whole population because of that stigma. They felt stigma was quite strong in their community. Whereas in Tampa Bay, they were really interested in this idea of food swamps. There was a proliferation of unhealthy food, but there a low-cost unhealthy food, but there really wasn't pre-prepared meals that were healthy and accessible to people in Tampa. In New Orleans, the challenge that they were really interested in focusing on was this idea that information can be really siloed within parishes about resources and where they're available. And so if you lived within a particular parish and you had access to that information, that's great. But if you lived in the very next parish, that information wasn't flowing very well between those things, those different parishes. And so they wanted to address that knowledge gap of what resources were available when and where. So each one of them developed a different experiment, and we work with the different food banks to do an MVS, meaning viable service, to prototype each one of those. As we imagine, through this whole process, we learned a lot of great insights, again, building on the deep quantitative work that had already been done, learning more about what dignity really looks like and how do people see charitable food versus what we call in US food stamps or SNAP. We learned a lot about these different kind of mental models about charitable food. So one thing highlighting here is that as we talked to people, they had very different ideas of how they saw charitable food and how it fit into their lives. For some, getting assistance wasn't a challenge. And for some, they really didn't see the government or wanting any assistance from outside organizations. And so stigma was a greater barrier. For some, they felt like they were in this situation for a short period of time. Maybe they just lost their job and they thought, oh, a few months later, we'll be back on our feet. For others, more like Sherman, they were in the situation more chronically, and so they saw the role of charitable food in a very different kind of way. And so there's lots of great takeaways from that, but the one that relates most to Order Ahead is this idea that I mentioned, that there was this whole population of people for whom stigma is the greatest barrier, and there weren't really any solutions to address that need. As we talked to that population, and we said, in what context would charitable food be more accessible to you? We heard things like, well, it needs to feel familiar. I feel like I'm only going to be in this situation for a while. I don't want to have to learn about this whole new charitable food ecosystem. It needs to feel discreet. I don't want to get outed by my neighbors. It needs to be convenient because I'm already working, 2 jobs or something, and I'm not available at 2 in when the food pantry is open. So we use that in conjunction with the experiments with Northern Illinois to run some tests. So I mentioned some of the experiments that we ran. So that first one, we just developed a WordPress site, and the test we were trying to prove was, could we reach people that were food insecure according to USDA criteria, which is a government entity in the US, but we're not going to food pantries. Could we reach that population through this? And through a series of experiments, we were able to show, yes, we were able to reach that population. 40 to 50% of the people showing up were people that were not otherwise going to food pantries, but were saying they didn't have enough food to get through the month. So we got to this point, and the initial objective was really just to kind of build this foundation of knowledge and to kind of tee up a roadmap. And we identified that this opportunity in particular, there seemed to be a national opportunity here, because this one food bank was taking this WordPress site that we had developed, and they were running with it. They were continuing to use it, but we didn't want 199 other food banks to have to develop this tool as well. So we said, as a national office, there's an opportunity for us here to develop this tool and share it for free with the network, so that they can deploy it in different kinds of ways, and we can use our resources most effectively. So that takes us to phase 2. Where we came out of this work, and at this point we were kind of functioning like a lab. Our role has sort of shifted over time, but we were functioning like a lab. And so we had this initial idea. We'd sort of proven that there's some desirability from our initial minimal viable experiments. But the challenge is we didn't have an owner for this solution. There was no one that was in charge of the neighbor experience at the national office. There wasn't anyone that was sort of willing to sort of take this on as a partner. And as an innovation team, we didn't want to be the team that was going to be owning this tool, because then we could become product owners and we're not able to kind of innovate and continue to develop and work on the next thing. So we were sort of in this conundrum, and we were making arguments to our leadership, trying different kinds of ways, and honestly not getting very far. Ultimately, where we did make success, so this lesson 1, was when we were able to compare this tool, Order Ahead, to an existing tool that had actually been developed within the organization, to show that it wasn't that different in terms of providing a tool and making it available to the network. So functionally, while it performed different service, we were able to make this comparison that allowed leadership to sort of see this tool in a different kind of way. The other thing was really helpful was to provide the mechanism to make that next step. So we said, okay, we ran a couple experiments. Give us the resources to run some more experiments in a few different areas, and give us some resources to build a beta version of this tool that's a little more reliable than a WordPress site, rather than going beyond that. And so with that kind of interim step, we were able to kind of reframe and de-risk a little bit some of the next steps, which allowed us to get those resources to move into the next phase of doing some experiments and building this beta. So it takes us into phase 3 of this work, where we ran sort of 3 different channels of work simultaneously. So this is where we're really, from service design perspective, thinking about the uncertainties on the front end and on the back end of this process. As you'd imagine, the food bank is the one that's picking and packing this food, and they're distributing it. So there's the whole back end that we have to think about in terms of how that worked, how that could scale, what are some of the challenges there. And then on the front end, on the neighbor side, we wanted to make sure that we were still providing that good experience and that we were reaching the people that we said we're able to reach. So these 3 sessions sort of work together. We kind of co-designed with two or three new food banks. We said, help us think through some of these challenges like eligibility. Who should be eligible for some of these things? Or, should it be item level products, or should it be kind of some pre-packed and some item level? And that has a big impact on kind of the viability of some of these programs. And so we were able to kind of talk through some of these things in these co-design sessions, and then immediately run experiments to test these, get some data on that, and then revisit those conversations. And at some point, we gained enough buy-in from our leadership to say, okay, great, now you can go forward and start to build the alpha and beta version of this tool. And so those experiments then directly informed the user stories that informed the development of the alpha and beta tool. So it was very much this useful process where one step sort of informed the next step of the process. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we decided on what experiments to run. So I found the Adaptive Path did a workshop, I can't remember, several years ago at a great conference that I went to. It wasn't the Service Design Global Conference, but another great conference. And I thought they had a few great frameworks that I think were really useful, right? So with any service proposition, there are uncertainties. And so thinking about what are those key uncertainties, or balance breakthrough is a good way to think about that. And then Anna May, I'm trying to think of her last name, Chang recently came out with a book called Lean Impact, which I highly recommend as a great book. She also suggests in the social sector, we should always be considering impact and scale and uncertainties around those in terms of tests. So thinking about what those uncertainties are and then plotting those and just saying, well, how much confidence do you have about those uncertainties? And which of those uncertainties, if you're wrong about them, are really going to be detrimental to the ultimate viability of whatever service you're trying to propose. And so we essentially went through this process as we thought about what experiments do we want to run. And those sort of evolved over time, right? I'll talk in the next slide, I'll sort of talk about one of those experiments. But ultimately, then it's like the process that we're familiar with, right? Where you develop a hypothesis, you build whatever you need to test it, you test it, you learn, and you say, what did you learn? And then you evolve and iterate as we're all familiar with. Which is wanted to share a little bit about this process, if it's helpful to all of you in terms of how do we think about running experiments and what experiments should we run? Because honestly, it can be overwhelming to think about, there's so many different types of experiments. But this had a great impact on helping us to figure out specifically what things did we want to test, and then how do we, as we learn those things, we can incorporate that into features that inform the development of the alpha and beta tool. So as one example of those, and this was one of the experiments that we ran that wasn't a thing we thought would be important, honestly. But as we were running these experiments, we were getting no-show rates of 25%. So people were placing orders and 25% of people were not coming to pick it up. And as we talked to the CEOs at these food banks, they said, that's not sustainable. I'm not going to run a program where 25% of people aren't showing up. So it became something that we really needed to test and evaluate. And so just borrowing from dentists, because dentists have already figured this out, we just deployed a series of reminders in different kinds of ways. And as you kind of see in the graph there, as we tried different types of reminders and different types of sequences, we were able to get the no-show rate down to a certain percentage. And ultimately, our major deciders here were the 3 CEOs that were our partners with us. And we said, is this an acceptable rate? No, okay, let's continue to explore and refine some of these things. So I just want to share one example of the maybe 15 different types of experiments that we were running. Other things, we ran experiments around eligibility. What are the right kinds of criteria that we can think about that balances food banks' need for confidence about reaching the right audience with not turning people away, because we're trying to reach people from stigma as the greatest barrier, or other things around what's the right channel to reach people if we're trying to reach people that are not going to a pantry. So just leveraging different types of messages, A/B tests, as you normally would in that scenario. So going back to our story, then we had run these experiments. We developed a beta tool. We still didn't have an owner for this tool. We were really struggling to figure out who within the organization was going to own this, and we were just telling a certain story, and that story just wasn't resonating. So we were still in this place of owning this beta tool, being the project managers of it, product managers, and not being able to find a place within the organization for it. And so where things sort of really changed was, at the time, the organization was really at a broader scale, really focusing on the neighbor experience and saying, how can we support food banks to provide a better neighbor experience? So the story and the priorities of the organization were changing. At the same time, COVID, unfortunately, was developing, and the need for socially distanced pickup became particularly important. And so what we're able to do is change the story and reframe the value proposition of the tool to better align with the strategic imperatives of the organization and the imperatives of our customers, our food banks, who are trying to provide these more socially distanced tools. And that really helped both to find better leadership support, but it also helped to reframe and say, okay, now maybe the tool could actually end up living on this other team and not in the place that we thought we were really advocating for it to live. And ultimately that was a great success there. So the lesson there is just make sure that you're always solving your organizational and team priorities. Ideally, we should always start with our partners and make sure that we have a business owner in mind. That's where so much innovation fails, is if you don't have that handoff from whatever your deliverable is back to the business owner. And so ideally, you're starting with that business owner. But if you don't have that, you need to make sure you're telling the right stories and finding ways that this tool is solving their problems, as well as organizational problems, to make sure that you're getting the resources you need and the buy-in from your partners. The other kind of related to that is go where the momentum is going. I like to think of judo. Judo is a way, a martial arts where you're using the other person's momentum against them. In this case, you're not using it against them, but you're using that momentum and you're saying, okay, the momentum is already going in this direction. How can I be better aware of where that momentum is going, and then utilize that to better advocate for the tools or the resources and the services that you're trying to promote. The last lesson here from this phase was that we really needed to, again, make it easier for leadership to manage growth. We didn't have a lot of models within the organization of developing tools, right? That's not something that we typically had done, although we've done it a few times. And so by thinking about what are the right measures, we didn't have a great sense of neighbor experience. So we really relied on our qualitative research to say, well, neighbors really care about time, right? They feel like they're having to spend a lot of time in places. So we utilized those as measures. Neighbors really cared about different kinds of measures that we're able to incorporate into the evaluation for our leadership. And for food banks, we wanted to make sure that they felt they were able to operationally, viably provide these services. So we took that qualitative information and we turned those into measures, and then we shared that back with our leadership, and we said, here's some measures, here's some ways we can evaluate whether or not this is successful. And I can get more into that in the Q&A as well. And so that was another lesson learned, that if the measures don't exist to evaluate success, then work with your leadership to help at least prototype those and let those evolve over time. So just to kind of recap some of those lessons, make sure as you're developing a resource or a tool as an in-house designer, compare things to what's already known. Find things that are known and accepted within the organization and make those comparisons. It's easier for leadership and for your partners to sort of wrap their minds around something if you could frame it in a way that they already understand. Those early adopters are critical advocates. So I guess I forgot this lesson, but as we were going through those food banks that were those earlier testers, they continued to test and they continued to try different things. And we were learning so much about basically their early failures. We were able to iterate the tools, as you would imagine, using Excel spreadsheets at the beginning. Those things ultimately translated to better products and services, as we went down the line. But they also became advocates to our leadership, because they're essentially the customers coming back and saying, I see how important this is. This is changing how we're able to provide value or provide a more dignified experience to the people we serve. And their voices were far more powerful than our voices internally. Knowing your internal stakeholders, priorities is so important. As I mentioned, it's ideally you're always starting with the business owner in mind. But if sometimes that's not possible, making sure that you're telling the right story to make sure it's connecting both with their challenges and their priorities. Always have a sense as to where the momentum is going in the organization, and make sure that your work is connected to that, but also being able to reframe your work so that it is connected to those things. And if it's not connected to that, then maybe you need to reevaluate and make sure that it is connected to where the energy is going within the organization. And then finally, if mechanisms don't exist to measure and evaluate success, then use our design skills to prototype those measures and iterate those measures, because leadership needs a way to kind of evaluate risk. And if those measures don't exist, then we need to be there to support them to do that. So as the last slide, where is Order Ahead now? It's now grown. So it is embedded within one team of the organization, and there's a product manager that does an amazing job of managing the tool and getting input and continue to evolve the tool over time. There's 34 plus food banks that are using this tool as of December. And neighbors 78% of neighbors say they're experiencing time. So we have automated surveys that are populated as neighbors are using this. We're learning about NPS. I think it's over 80. So neighbors are having a good experience. And as you see from the quotes on the side, it's providing people with a completely different way to access charitable food that's convenient, that's discreet, and that really provides a more dignified experience for those that are accessing charitable food. For those that live in the US, NBC Nightly News actually did a story on the San Antonio food bank that's using Order Ahead, and featured Order Ahead just last week. So that was pretty exciting. So as a team, we're continuing to learn from our mistakes, making sure that we're aligned to our organizational goals, and trying to take the time to see where the momentum is going within the organization. But we just wanted to share some of our lessons learned with this kind of one use case, so that hopefully you can build upon those lessons learned and not have to learn them yourself. I want to acknowledge that design innovation takes a team, and the people listed here, as well as many others, were part of this work and made this work happen. So I want to re-emphasize that it was not about Dan, it's about a team of people that you see here. And I think with that, I'm going to transition to Q&A. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn